The AIRHAS or AIRHAS Barefoot shoe from Amazon. Let's discuss how to pronounce the brand name of this shoe, please, in the comments below because I'm at a loss here. But three things to like with this shoe is number one, the price point. I think if you're going to invest in this shoe, the price point is probably why you're even considering them in the first place. So this model comes in at $37.99 USD. So that does put it on the much more budget-friendly side of barefoot shoes. And so if you are a beginner or you are strapped on a budget and you are just getting a barefoot shoe to potentially feel out to see if you like them, or if you're just somebody who doesn't want to drop 200 or 160 like on a pair of Vivobarefoot shoes, totally understandable. This can be a really great option to look into. Honestly, for the price point, I feel like the shoe's construction and performance has done a pretty good job. And that takes me into my second pro or thing to like, which is the performance of this shoe. In the gym, this model does a really good job for lifting. The outsole is grippy enough for most training sessions on most surfaces. This model hasn't had any issues on rubber gym floors or wooden platforms, and the upper is secure enough to do plyos and whatnot in it. So I've been using this shoe primarily for my sessions where I'm doing some strength, hypertrophy, and then also some like hit or cross training style work blended into my sessions, because that is how I typically train, which is strength component, hypertrophy, and then more like athletic style workouts. And this model has done a good job for most of those. It's flexible enough to give you that articulation you want, and the outsole again does have enough grip. And the upper is secure enough. Granted, I don't necessarily love it, and I'll talk about why in my cons, but for the most part, the shoe's construction I think is pretty well rounded and it does a decent job for a lot of different things in the gym. The third thing to like with this shoe is that it does have a slightly thicker sole here, so it doesn't feel as minimalist as other barefoot shoes, and it has a slightly thicker foam insole. So you can leave this in to get a little bit more cushion, which is also why I like this shoe for beginners on top of its price point. But it's also going to give you a little bit more protection out of the box. And now keep in mind, the reason it does have these slightly thicker materials, in my opinion, is because it is cheaper made. It's not going to be as articulative as like the active sole here in the Primus Lite 3.5 model. But when it comes to foot protection and whatnot, and still giving you enough articulation, the shoe does a pretty good job. And I do like the thicker boot construction. If you like a little bit more structure to your barefoot shoe, especially around the boot, that would be something that I think you'll also enjoy with this model. But now let's talk about a couple of cons that I have with the AIRHAS Barefoot shoe. All right, so three cons that I have with this barefoot shoe is number one, the tongue. This tongue kind of infuriates me, to be quite honest with you. So there's obviously not a gusset in this shoe, and what ends up happening with this model, it's a thin mesh tongue here, so you can have a little bit of friction, but the biggest issue that I have with it is that it slides down. So when you are training, especially if you're doing more dynamic stuff, if you're not filling out the shoe, which I don't think a lot of foot anatomies are going to unless you have a very high instep or thick foot, this is going to slide down even if you crank those laces tight. I don't love that feature. It's annoying to have to constantly pull it up, but that is kind of one of those things that just comes along with the budget shoe. It's probably an oversight from the construction. They're probably not as well made regarding how specific they are with their intentions, with what this shoe is going to be used for. And so all that to say, the tongue is pretty annoying. And if you are OCD about your tongue being secure and not moving while you're training, that is going to be something that I would say infuriates you, and probably pass on this model, look into different shoes. The second con that I have with the shoe is this TPU overlay up here on the forefoot. So at the toe break here, this can get pretty dang uncomfortable. And so if you have thicker feet or more blocky feet, this is going to be a problem for you in my opinion. This overlay right here with this double TPU layer is pretty dang harsh and aggressive. It almost feels similar to like the Primus Lite knit and stuff when you have that pressure in that lateral forefoot, but this model actually digs a little bit more because this TPU is just a lot more bulky and it's a lot more built out, and it doesn't feel like it has as much maneuverability. And if you are somebody that is typically prone to having issues with toe break in shoes and you have to be very specific with the type of shoes you wear, definitely consider that with this shoe, and you might want to pass on them as well, because again, this is just like I think one of those oversights with the construction of the shoe where it's going to be okay for most folks, but it is a feature that I think is just kind of an oversight, and that comes with the budget friendly nature of this shoe. The third con that I have with this model is, like most shoes sold on Amazon, like Witten and this shoe, I like them for their budget-friendly price points, and I like that they open the door for a lower bar to entry for folks who might not have a bunch of money to spend on shoes to get into barefoot shoes. My issue though is that with most of these models, they are kind of white labeled and marked up and sold at a budget-friendly price, but in reality, they're actually just wicked budget-friendly, and they are just generally scraping designs from more authentic brands in the space. And so with that in mind, I wouldn't feel guilty if you want to get this shoe, But I do go back and forth constantly on some of these Amazon brands where it's just a white labeled shoe that's being marked up and sold as budget friendly, because it is kind of taking away from some of those more authentic brands out there. But overall, the shoe does a decent job for the price. And at the end of the day, if you don't want to drop 100 plus on barefoot shoes, I can't fault you for that. And this can be a decent option. But now let's break down the performance of this shoe. To break down the performance of this model, I will discuss how they do for lifting, cross training, and daily wear. I did not do runs in this shoe. I do not like the toe break. It is not comfortable, and I'm not putting myself into the toe pain just to test a vertical that I know is going to be subpar to begin with. All that to say though, for lifting, the shoe has done a decent job. I like that you can take the insole out and get closer to the ground if you want more barefoot shoe feel. And I also like that this sole here, it does have that flatter construction. It kind of reminds me of the Avances model in the sense that it does have that nice flat sole. And so if you are big on having a shoe that is a lot more flat versus like a Primus Light 3.5 here, which is a little bit more rounded, this can be a really good thing for you, especially in the context of deadlifts, squats, sumo deadlifts, etc. The rubber outsole does a decent job at gripping on different surfaces. And so if you are that lifter that is going to train on machines, rubber gym floors, or even squat and whatnot on platforms, this model will do a decent job at giving you enough grip. Now, I don't necessarily love how dense this outsole can feel. I like some of the other models that have slightly more aggressive lugs for certain training contexts. Like for example, if I'm doing any form of explosive work on turf, I like those models a little bit better. But for general strength stuff on your more traditional gym floors, this shoe should suffice pretty well. I also like that it does have a good amount of flexibility despite running a little bit more stiff. Now with that flexibility, keep in mind this TPU is going to be a little bit annoying. So for split squats and lunges and whatnot, you will notice this in my opinion, especially if you are somebody with a slightly wider foot where your pinky might be pushing into this lateral sidewall more. And so I don't love that about this shoe, but for the most part, the flexibility is good. And if this toe break doesn't bother you, then that's kind of a non-issue and I wouldn't necessarily stress that. I also like the upper security when it comes to giving you lateral support. This TPU is a little bit thicker, so it does give you a good level of security, especially for things like Cossack squats or if you're catching cleans and you're pushing in that lateral sidewall. This model should lock your foot down pretty well. Another thing to like with this shoe for lifting is that I do like the more structured boot here. So this model reminds me kind of the Stoic boot in the sense that it has a bit more padding around it. Like you can see the difference here between the Primus Light 3.5 and the AIRHAS model, and the boots are a lot different regarding how much play and structure you get out of them. So if you are somebody that likes that more locked down feel with your boot, that would be a good thing with this shoe. When it comes to cross training, the shoe is so-so. I don't necessarily love this shoe for cross training. If I'm going to be doing a lot of jumping or a lot of dynamic and agility work in the gym, I am not reaching for this shoe as my first pick. It will work, but if you have the option to go with something else and you have a heavy bias towards that style of training, I would say get a different shoe, because with this model, the three reasons why I don't love them for more cross-training focused workouts, and I talked about this in my cons, is number one, this tongue moving is just so annoying. Like I hate having to pull my tongue up all the time while I'm training. And if it's starting to slide to the right side, for example, you will feel that. And it's just so frustrating. It's like one of those little things where I'm like, why? The second thing is this TPU here. I've mentioned it multiple times in this video, but the pressure that you get in the lateral forefoot of the shoe, I don't necessarily love. It's okay for certain foot anatomies for sure, but if you have a wider foot or a higher instep or a very thick foot, this is likely going to bother you, especially when you're really digging into that forefoot, doing things like box jumps, broad jumps, a lot of jump rope, etc. That's going to be problematic. The third reason why I don't necessarily love this shoe for cross training, and I talked about this a little bit in my lifting section, is if I'm going to be doing a lot of dynamic work on turf. So for example, I am training for high rocks competition. I do a lot of my workouts on turf. I don't love the grip of this shoe for that. I think there are better barefoot shoes for tackling that ass that have slightly more grippy rubbers and more aggressive lugs for that style of training. But if you do need a shoe for some casual cross training sprinkled in with your lifting, this shoe can work. Just note that it does have some construction oversights that I think just kind of come along with it being that more budget friendly model and not necessarily probably having the most time spent on it regarding the performance and the construction elements in this shoe. When it comes to daily wear, the shoe is okay. It has a nice casual appearance, and so you can't really fault the appearance of this shoe. It looks very similar to, I think, like a blend of a Stoic shoe, a Vivobarefoot shoe, and it does have that kind of more standard appearance regarding the mesh and the TPU used in the shoe, and there's not a ton of branding, so I do like that as well for daily wear. And if you are somebody that wants that model, again, for just entry to barefoot shoes and just some walking and whatnot, this model can be a great bet, especially for the price. And so when it comes to my scoring of this shoe, for lifting, I would give this shoe a 7.5 out of 10. It will work for strength and hypertrophy, but again, it's not going to be your most dialed barefoot shoe on the market for strength and power workouts. When it comes to cross training, I'd give this shoe a 6.5 or 7 out of 10. It can work, but there are definitely some design flaws with its construction. And then for daily wear, I'd give the shoe a 7.5 out of 10 because it can be a decent option for beginners at a nice budget-friendly price. So when it comes to the price of this shoe, once again, you can expect to pay around $37.99 USD. I like that price point for this model. If you're, again, a beginner, this model makes a lot of sense, and I think it does a pretty good job for less than $40, which is putting it on the much more budget-friendly echelon of barefoot shoes. All right, so now let's answer the question, who should buy the AIRHAS Barefoot shoes? So number one, beginners, this can be a great option to go with, especially if you're just getting into barefoot shoes and you don't want to spend more than $50 for your first pair. The second context where I think the shoe makes a lot of sense is if you are somebody who wants a barefoot shoe primarily for lifting with a little bit of cross training and then also some daily wear, this shoe can fit that box really well. It's definitely a more lifting and more casual wear bias shoe in my opinion, if that's how you plan to use them. The third context is if you are somebody who has a lower volume foot or even a narrow or medium width foot, this model might be a really good bet for you because I don't think that this TPU is going to feel as aggressive for your foot anatomy. Now, who shouldn't buy this shoe? Number one, if you're somebody that needs a barefoot shoe for turf focus workouts or really tough cross training sessions or for running, you're going to want to pass on this model. This model is not going to be super dialed for those training contexts, and if that is your main training bias, this shoe I think is going to fall short. The second context where I think the shoe falls short is for blockier forefoots and for thicker feet. I don't think you're going to necessarily love this tongue here, and I don't think you're going to love this TPU here on the lateral forefoot. Keep that in mind if that is your foot anatomy. The third context where I think the shoe does fall short is if you are super dialed with how minimalist you want your shoes to feel, this shoe will likely feel a little bit just chunky to you in my opinion, and that's because the materials I just think aren't as nice as some of the more premium brands out there, again because it is kind of just your more run-of-the-mill budget-friendly barefoot shoe, so you kind of get what you get with the shoe. So it's not going to have anything proprietary with its construction and the details that go into it. All right, so you've decided that you're going to pass on this shoe. What should you go with instead? So two options that rival this model's price point include number one, the Witten models. They are a lot more soft. They're going to not be as aggressive with that toe break up here. And then also there's the AIRHAS Knit model on Amazon that I think just has a slightly more comfortable upper construction. And if that's big for you, that would definitely be a model to consider. If you don't mind spending a tiny bit more, you can look into Zero Shoes and Tolos. They offer models that are around like $90 to $110, and typically you can find models on sale through different outlets, so definitely shop around. But those would be my main alternatives if the shoe doesn't align with your needs based on the context where I don't think this shoe makes a lot of sense. When it comes to sizing and fit in this model, I think if you have a narrow to medium to slightly wider, so D or E width foot, this model should fit true to size. If you have a double E width foot or wider, I would say go up a half size, and that's solely because of this TPU layer here. I think that will give you hopefully enough room. Because it is an Amazon shoe or a shoe that you can buy on Amazon, returns are pretty easy, so that is a perk of this model. If it doesn't fit perfectly, it's a pretty easy exchange and return using Amazon, so definitely keep that in mind before you buy. But I think true to size should be the move for narrow, medium to slightly wider feet. And then if you have a foot width wider than double E, go up a half size. I think that's a safe call in this shoe. So when it comes to the weight, heel toe drop, and insole in this model, for my size 10 model here, we have a weight of 9.05 ounces. The heel to toe drop of the shoe sits at 0 millimeters, and this model does have a thin foam removable insole, which you can see does have a little bit more thickness up here in the forefoot, and the internal construction is finished, so you can take that insole out if you want a little bit more barefoot feel in this model. All right, so now let's cover the construction of the AIRHAS Barefoot shoe. So up here on the toe box and then around the midfoot here, we have this TPU layer. This material is a little bit more rigid and dense. It does break in over time, but it's definitely thicker than other TPUs I have tested with other barefoot shoes. So keep that in mind. It's not going to be the softest model on the market regarding how this feels on your foot, which I've discussed many a times in this review. We also have a mesh material here on the forefoot, midfoot, and then back here in the boot. The boot itself does have a bit of padding here, so it does give you a bit more structure. The boot cup isn't crazy rigid, but it does have a bit more structure compared to other barefoot shoes, which I've also discussed. The tongue and the heel back here also have external loops here to help pull this shoe on. The tongue is not gusseted, and it's this thin mesh material, so again, it does slide down, and the tongue security is not the best. We have 5 core eyelets in this shoe with an additional loop here for tongue security, but again, that tongue security ain't really here with this shoe. Looking at the rubber outsole in this model, this material wraps up around the lateral side and the medial side of this shoe, which I do like from giving you a bit more structure and security when training, especially when doing lateral work. And then the outsole itself on the bottom has a full rubber tread with this more triangular like lug fashion. These are pretty low profile lugs, so you're not going to get a ton of bite on turf and whatnot, But again, they will grip decent enough for most gym contexts, so I wouldn't stress that too much unless you're really specific with your cross training and your turf training. And then once again, this model does have a removable insole, but that pretty much wraps up the gist of the shoe's construction. If you have additional questions, drop a comment down below. All right, y'all, that wraps up my review of the AIRHAS Barefoot shoes. Now, would I buy this shoe again? Probably not. This has not been my favorite budget-friendly model to date. Some of the Witten models, for example, I would buy again. Some of the other models that come from AIRHAS, I would buy again. But this model specifically, I just think there are design flaws that I don't love for the context of how I like to use my barefoot shoes. I do a lot of cross training, and for my daily wear shoes, I want them to be as comfortable as possible, and this shoe just doesn't tick those boxes. Great for beginners, but I think if you're trying to get as dialed as possible with your barefoot shoes, this model kind of falls short in my opinion. But if you have additional questions on this shoe and if you should go with them, drop a comment down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer. And as always, y'all, drop a like on the video, drop a subscribe to the channel. I will see you guys in the next one.